and he has co-authored what to my mind is the most notable contribution to political science theory, at least for a decade. And the book is fresh off the mint. It's called Neoclassical Realist Theory of International Politics. And he has published this book together with two of our former visiting fellows here at the Nobel Institute, Norrin Ripsman and Steve Lobel. Jeffrey Taliaferro is one of those scholars that I try to read absolutely everything that he publishes, and he's a man that I, for one, expect great things from, also in the years to come. And I hope that he will give us a small sample of his genius, if I may say so. Today, he is here to address us on a big topic: the United States, alliance coercion, and paths to regional peace. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big round of applause for Professor Taliaferro.
Thank you very much, Asle. I'm indebted to Asle Toge and to Olive Nullstad and to the other staff of the Norwegian Nobel Institute for the warm hospitality they've shown me since I've arrived in Oslo a few days ago. And it's really a great privilege and honor for me to be a visiting fellow at the Nobel Institute. I'm honored to follow in the footsteps of my Tufts University colleague, David Ekblad, who's a noted historian of U.S. foreign relations and who spoke to you a few months ago about the birth of American globalism during the Great Depression of the 1930s. And I'm especially pleased and honored to follow in the footsteps of my close friends and longtime collaborators, Steve Lobel of the University of Utah and Norrin Ripsman of Concordia University. As Asle mentioned, Steve, Norrin, and I are the co-authors of Neoclassical Realist Theory of International Politics. It's the culmination of a collaboration that goes back to 2003. And I am gratified and humbled that our book has garnered so much attention among scholars and practitioners in Europe, especially in Scandinavia and Germany. The topic of my remarks this evening is not neoclassical realist theory of international politics, or NCR-TIP, as I prefer to call it as a shorthand, but rather my single-authored book project, which is tentatively titled Frenemies: The Politics of Alliance Coercion in U.S. Foreign Policy During the Cold War and After. I'm sure that an acquisition editor or the marketing department will probably shorten that title. But briefly, my book project is an examination of alliance coercion, or more properly, intra-alliance coercion, which I'm defining as the use of conditional threats and promises by U.S. officials in an effort to induce a change in the cost-benefit calculations and thus the behavior of a dependent ally. My analysis in the book is limited to asymmetric alliances between the United States and other states. A necessary condition for intra-alliance coercion, I contend, is a fair degree of security dependence by the weaker ally on the United States. Now, I want to be clear at the outset that conceiving of alliance coercion strictly in terms of a threat by the United States to outright abandon an ally, that is, to terminate a security treaty, or to withdraw U.S. forces from the Allies' territory, or to give up basing rights, is perhaps too narrow. And it's too narrow in the sense that it is both a very extreme step for the United States to take, and it's really just at one end of a continuum of different coercive strategies that various U.S. presidential administrations, from the dawn of the Cold War up to the Obama administration, have employed vis-a-vis allies around the world. Various tools that US officials have used to coerce, or perhaps more politely, persuade US allies have included, in addition to basing rights and weapons sales, they've included the extension or the reinterpretation of security guarantees, conventional arms sales, economic assistance packages, controls on exports and interdiction of exports, foreign military financing to enable the ally to buy US-made weapon systems. All of these are important tools of a US alliance coercion. Now, in the Frenemies book project in general, and in my remarks this evening, I'm going to be building on 3 sets of variables, which Ripsman, Lobel, and I developed at length in NCRTED. The first 2 are explanatory variables, or potential causes of US behavior, and they pertain to the international system. The third is an intervening variable at the unit level. That is, a variable that stands between what is going on outside the United States and the actual policies that an administration is going to pursue vis-a-vis its weaker ally. And this intervening variable pertains to how the top leaders of the United States, or what Nora and Stephen and I refer to as the foreign policy executive, generally the president and the senior members of his, or perhaps next year, perhaps her national security team, the senior officials who are actually charged with the formulation and the conduct of national security strategy. But these variables pertain to the types of domestic institutions through which these officials have to navigate, and the types of bargains that they have to strike with certain actors in order to pursue their preferred policies. So starting from the outside and working our way in, the first of these external variables, the first of these causal variables, is the nature of the United States strategic environment. That is, the magnitude and the imminence of international threats and international opportunities that the United States faces at any given time. The second explanatory variable or potential cause is the degree of systemic clarity. That refers to the degree to which the members of the foreign policy executive can discern those external threats or external opportunities, the time frame in which they expect those threats or opportunities to manifest themselves, and whether or not they can actually identify a single optimal set of policies to redress or perhaps even eliminate the threat or exploit the opportunity. So those are the 2 potential causes. The intervening variable is the domestic mobilization hurdles. That is, the anticipated support for, or the anticipated opposition to, the administration's preferred foreign and security policies by members of Congress and by members of certain interest groups. Now, the theme of this spring's Nobel Institute seminar series is the causes of peace. And my remarks this evening are going to focus on one aspect of the linkage between the United States' role as a global hegemon and regional peace, specifically alliance coercion in the area of nuclear non-proliferation. The maintenance of the United States' preponderant position in the international system has been a consistent and overriding goal, sometimes explicitly stated, sometimes implicit, of every presidential administration going back to Harry Truman. I largely subscribe to an argument first made by Melvin Loeffler in the early 1990s in a book aptly called Preponderance of Power. So the maintenance of the United States' overwhelming power advantage in the international system has really been at the core of every articulation of US grand strategy. And as part of that, the United States has relied very heavily on a network of alliances around the world. Currently, the United States has security arrangements of some sort with approximately 66 different countries. And they range from highly institutionalized multilateral defense pacts such as NATO to long-standing bilateral mutual defense treaties such as the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty and the U.S. Republic of Korea Security Treaty, to informal executive agreements or understandings, or to even more informal agreements to sell and weapon systems and to maintain weapon systems for certain strategic partners in various parts of the world. Military alliances have helped the United States underpin its hegemonic role for close to 60 years. Now, nuclear non-proliferation has also been a key element of U.S. grand strategy for the past 70 years. According to the historian Frank Gavin, nuclear proliferation, the containment of great power adversaries, and the promotion of an open global economy have been the three overarching and interrelated objectives of U.S. grand strategy going back to the Truman administration. Moreover, according to Gavin, and as I will elaborate on in a few minutes' time, sometimes the pursuit of one of those three legs of U.S. grand strategic objectives, containment, economic openness, and nuclear non-proliferation, has come at the expense of the other two. And this is precisely what happens, or what will happen, in my remarks this evening. Beginning especially with the Kennedy administration in the early 1960s, successive administrations, both Democratic and Republican, have deemed halting or at least slowing the spread of nuclear weapons or the capacity to quickly develop nuclear weapons as not only critical to international and regional security, but as necessary to underpin the United States' role as a global hegemon. Successive administrations, as most of us know, from Kennedy to Obama, have gone to great lengths to preclude adversaries of the United States from acquiring nuclear weapons. For example, last summer's Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action signed by Iran and the permanent 5 members of the Security Council plus Germany is the most recent example of the lengths to which the United States has gone over the past several years. Now, some would argue that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is already a success because Iran has actually dismantled its capacity to produce highly enriched uranium. It's dismantled its centrifuges and its reprocessing equipment. It shipped its stockpile of highly enriched uranium out of the country in exchange for relief from UN Security Council and US economic sanctions, which were crippling its economy. Critics of the plan claim that it's far too early to tell. Some critics of the plan say that it is inherently flawed. Indeed, the foremost critic of the plan, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, has repeatedly said it's a bad deal. Anything that leads to or leaves Iran with even a residual ability to produce enriched uranium is an existential threat to Israel. Moreover, it's a flawed deal because some of its most important provisions only last for 15 years. Moving further eastward, North Korea's repeated nuclear weapons tests and ballistic missile tests, 5, I believe, since Kim Jong-un succeeded his father, Kim Il-sung, are a continuing and clear threat to the stability of the Asia-Pacific region. Less well known among the general public, at least in the United States, however, but of increasing interest to international historians and to political scientists who study international relations, have been the extraordinary lengths to which successive presidential administrations, both Democratic and Republican, have gone to thwart the nuclear ambitions of the United States' own allies. There have recently been a number of books and articles which have looked at this phenomena, and my book project seeks to contribute to this literature. Again, as in the cases involving U.S. efforts to deny nuclear weapons technology or nuclear weapons to adversaries, here the record has been mixed. There have been some areas in which arguably the United States has failed miserably, others in which the United States has arguably succeeded quite well. There have been at least 3 cases in the 1960s and the 1970s in which the United States successfully coerced strategically vulnerable allies into halting or even abandoning nuclear weapons programs. Those states include the Federal Republic of Germany, the Republic of Korea, and Taiwan. In another case, however, the United States simply acquiesced to an ally's status as a de facto nuclear weapons state, but did so in exchange for certain promises, namely that that ally would not conduct a nuclear test and would neither confirm nor deny the existence of its nuclear arsenal. I'm speaking here of Israel. Here, the Nixon administration hoped to use the sale of conventional weapons to Israel as leverage to get the Israeli government under Golda Meir to make concessions to return territories captured from Syria, Jordan, and Egypt during the Six-Day War of June 1967. It didn't work out that way. But by doing so, officials in the Nixon administration thought in 1969 that they could preclude the further growth of Soviet influence in the Middle East in the early 1970s. And there's another case that I want to touch upon. The United States, in this particular instance, only succeeded, or maybe it succeeded marvelously, in slowing down another ally's development or rush towards nuclear breakout and the weaponization of its nuclear capacity by a number of years. But it did so while simultaneously tolerating that ally's clandestine smuggling of nuclear components, not just from the United States, but from other countries as well. I'm speaking here about Pakistan. In this case, the perceived necessity of arming the Afghan Mujahideen fighting against the Soviet army in Afghanistan and of bolstering Pakistan as a bulwark against potential Soviet expansion into South Asia and eventually into the Persian Gulf weighed far more heavily in the calculations of the Carter administration and especially the Reagan administration than U.S. non-proliferation concerns in South Asia. And we live with the results to this day. So I'm going to pose 2 questions, and I'm going to address the first one in my remarks and then come back to the second one towards the end. The 2 questions are as follows. When will the United States attempt to facilitate regional peace by employing conditional threats and inducements toward an ally in an effort to restrain or even halt that ally from developing a nuclear weapons program or continuing with a nuclear weapons program? The second question, which I'm going to come to at the end, is this. What lessons might be drawn from these arguably unsuccessful or less than successful efforts by U.S. presidential administrations to convince regional allies to halt the development of their nuclear weapons capacity or to refrain from undertaking or conducting nuclear tests? My argument is as follows. The likelihood of a presidential administration pursuing a coercive strategy towards an ally is first and foremost a function of the international system, specifically the strategic environment in which the United States finds itself in the region, and the clarity of international threats and opportunities as perceived by officials in Washington. Those systemic variables in turn influence the height of the domestic mobilization hurdles that presidential administrations have to overcome in Washington. That is, the degree of support or opposition to their policies by members of Congress or by lobbying groups acting on behalf of a foreign ally. Presidents and their administrations, the members of the Foreign Policy Executive, are more likely to pursue strong, hardline coercive strategies to forestall an ally's development or continuation of nuclear weapons programs when they perceive the United States to be facing a restrictive strategic environment in that particular region, and where they perceive a high degree of clarity regarding the threats and opportunities to U.S. interests in that region, since the domestic mobilization hurdles that they have to overcome are likely to be relatively low. Conversely, when officials perceive the United States as facing a more permissive strategic environment in a particular region, and when and where they perceive less clarity in terms of the threats and the opportunities available to the United States in that region, domestic mobilization hurdles are going to be higher. It's going to be more difficult for presidents and members of their national security teams to convince Congress or to convince domestic interest groups lobbying on behalf of an ally of the desirability and the necessity of pursuing a hardline strategy toward that ally. Hence, in those circumstances, they are more likely to pursue soft line strategies or to not even attempt to coerce an ally. So what I'm going to do in the remainder of the time that I have allotted is to discuss these three instances of intra-alliance coercion involving the United States and two vulnerable allies who sought to develop nuclear weapons during the last part of the Cold War. The Nixon administration's decision, in effect, to acquiesce, to recognize Israel as a de facto nuclear weapons state in the autumn of 1969 in exchange for Israeli assurances not to conduct a nuclear weapons test and not to make public declarations about their nuclear arsenal and force posture. Second, the Carter administration's bargaining with the government of Pakistan's military dictator, General Mohammad Zia-ul-Haq, in the period from March of 1977 to December 1980. First, over the cancellation of Pakistan's planned purchase of a French uranium reprocessing plant, then over the discovery of Pakistan's parallel effort to produce highly enriched uranium, the actual fuel for a nuclear device, and the imposition of sanctions in the form of the termination of U.S. military and economic assistance to Islamabad in April of 1979 under the terms of the Symington Amendment. Following by the Carter administration's efforts to reset U.S.-Pakistan relations when the Soviet Union invaded neighboring Afghanistan in December of 1979. The third case, which I'm going to talk a bit about, is the Reagan administration and their decision to resume U.S. economic and military assistance to Pakistan in 1982, and President Ronald Reagan's personal articulation to General Zia of 4 red lines regarding Pakistan's nuclear program. No reprocessing, no assembly of a nuclear explosive device, no testing of a nuclear explosive device, and no transfer of sensitive nuclear technologies to other countries. Reagan, a year later, added a 5th red line. No uranium enrichment above the 5% level. Now, Pakistan did not cross the first 3 red lines during Zia's tenure in office or during Reagan's tenure in office. Pakistan routinely crossed the 4th and the 5th red line. These are cases that I think are interesting in that they all involved allies in which the United States never, ever contemplated the forward deployment of U.S. troops to their territory, did not have extensive basing rights on their territory, These were states that were never under the U.S. strategic umbrella, that is, the nuclear umbrella. Therefore, abandonment in terms of withdrawing U.S. troops or pulling out U.S. bases wasn't an option. It just simply wasn't an option. Other coercive strategies, such as suspending U.S. economic and military assistance, conventional weapons sales, foreign military assistance, were employed by these administrations, these three administrations, and as I mentioned earlier, the Carter administration actually did, much to its regret, terminate U.S. military and economic assistance to Pakistan in the spring of 1979. Neither of these were major treaty allies of the United States. There never has been a mutual defense treaty between Israel and the United States. There was a 1959 executive agreement between Pakistan and the United States, which the Carter administration did invoke when the Soviet Union invaded neighboring Afghanistan in December of 1979. But that fell well short of an actual mutual defense pact, and the Zia government, a month later, asked the Carter administration for an actual treaty of alliance, and the Carter administration said, we couldn't get it ratified by the Senate, so it's a non-starter. The time frame for these episodes varies. The first case that I talk about, Israel and the Nixon administration, occurred over a matter of months, roughly from January of 1969 to September, October of the same year. Whereas the cases involving Pakistan occurred over a span of about 8 years, 8.5 years actually, from roughly April of 1977, 11 years, to April of 1988. In all of the cases, the depth and the scope of U.S. strategic commitments in South Asia and in the Middle East increased. Indeed, it was the necessity of trying to pursue multiple strategic objectives in those two regions which complicated the efforts by the Nixon, Carter, and Reagan administrations to pursue coercive strategies to rein in the nuclear weapons programs of Pakistan and of Israel much earlier. So what exactly am I trying to explain? I'm trying to explain the types of strategies which presidential administrations pursued vis-a-vis allies, measured along a continuum from strong to weak. I'm defining a strong or a hardline coercive strategy as one that is going to entail, or was perceived to entail, relatively high political, economic, or opportunity costs for the United States, as well as for the ally. Whereas I am tending to define a weaker coercive strategy as one that is going to entail, or is perceived to entail, lower political, military, or economic costs to the United States and to the ally. Now, these anticipated costs are highly contextual. I'm trying to explain intra-alliance coercion in a period of time that coincided with the last quarter century of the Cold War. So the anticipated costs of coercive strategy for officials in Washington depended upon the Allies' degree of military dependence, security dependence on the United States, the particular region in which the ally was located, the perceived implications of an overt rupture with that ally, both for U.S. relations with other states in that region, as well as for U.S. domestic politics. In other words, the costs were contextual. I'm interested in explaining variation in the types of coercive strategies that the United States pursued. I'm not necessarily interested in this project in explaining the systemic outcomes, that is, who ultimately prevailed over the long run. And the reason is quite simple. Bargaining between states occurs over a prolonged period of time. There are feedback effects, and I recognize this. For the purposes of this talk and for the purposes of the paper that I'm writing regarding these three cases, I'm focusing narrowly on these particular instances of intra-alliance coercion involving nuclear non-proliferation, realizing that, of course, the consequences of the strategies that these three administrations pursued were not just confined to the nuclear non-proliferation issue, but had spillover effects into other aspects of the U.S. bilateral relationships with Israel and Pakistan, and had implications for what subsequent administrations could or could not do with respect to U.S. relations with those allies. So I am quite aware of that. Now let me speak just briefly about the data which I'm looking at. I am a qualitative international relations scholar, or as my colleague David Ekblad frequently says, I speak broken historian. I don't speak a word of Norwegian, just broken historian. I'm primarily looking at declassified documents from 4 sources. Large troves, several hundred documents obtained from the Nixon, Carter, and Reagan presidential libraries under the Freedom of Information Act and Mandatory Declassification Review, electronic briefing books obtained from those libraries and from the National Archives and Record Administration in College Park, Maryland, under the Freedom of Information Act and under Mandatory Declassification Review. I'm also looking at documents which have been posted on the subscription-only Digital National Security Archives, and finally compilations of documents published in the Foreign Relations of the United States series, published by the Office of the Historian at the State Department. When necessary, I look at secondary documents or secondary sources. And as this project moves forward and as I look at cases that are closer to the present and involve issues other than nuclear non-proliferation at the height of the Cold War, it will become necessary to actually consult more secondary sources. So what I want to do in the time remaining is to lay out 2 alternative sets of hypotheses on intra-alliance coercion derived from other schools of international relations: structural realism, also called neo-realism, and liberalism, or innenpolitik, respectively. Then I'm going to talk a little bit more about my neoclassical realist theory of intra-alliance coercion, and again, how it builds upon some of the arguments that Nora and Stephen and I develop in NCR TIP, before talking about the 3 cases in a bit more depth. And then finally, I'm going to conclude by coming back to that second question, which I posed at the outset, which was, what lessons can we learn from these supposedly unsuccessful attempts by the United States to coerce 2 allies into slowing down or halting their respective nuclear weapons programs? Structural realism, as the name implies, is a body of theory associated largely with the writings of Kenneth Waltz, although not exclusively with Kenneth Waltz. And as the name implies, it posits a very important role for the structure of the international system. That is, its anarchic order and principle and the relative distribution of material capabilities among states. In explaining broad patterns of international bargaining outcomes, and also, contrary to Waltz, in explaining the foreign policy behavior of major states. Stephen, Noren, and I talk about the need to test any neoclassical realist hypothesis against what we refer to as the structural realist baseline. That is, how much of the observed behavior can be explained by just simply looking at the structure of the international system, by simply looking at the distribution of power among states. If you can explain it by simply looking at the distribution of power, then you have no need to develop a neoclassical realist theory. Structural realism will tell you everything that you need to know. Now, as I said, structural realism privileges the relative distribution of power. The baseline assumption of structural realism is that international bargaining outcomes are going to tend to mirror the distribution of power among states. As Thucydides wrote, the strong do what they will, the weak endure what they have to endure. Furthermore, structural realism, unlike the classical realism associated with American scholars like Walter Lippmann, George Kennan, Henry Kissinger, Hans Morgenthau, basically treats the state as a black box. It assumes that what we refer to as the foreign policy executive, the top people who make foreign and security policy on behalf of the state, have unlimited access to their state's material resources. They don't have to worry about domestic politics. They can respond quickly and efficiently to international threats and opportunities. Therefore, based on that summary, one might expect that structural realism would say that on issues of interest to US policymakers, and given the tremendous imbalance of power between the United States and allies such as Israel and Pakistan, one would expect policymakers in Washington to consistently pursue hardline strategies when it comes to nuclear nonproliferation. If the members of the president's national security team conclude that the allies' actions are harmful or likely to be harmful to US strategic interests. There's a problem here. Remember I said that structural realism is associated largely with the writings of Kenneth Waltz. I am one of those people who has built a career out of dealing with the contradictions that arise in Waltz's writings, for which I am eternally grateful. Waltz writes, first of all, that in a bipolar international system, that is an international system with just two great powers or two superpowers, they don't have to worry about weaker allies. The two great powers will balance each other internally via arms racing. So the fears that great powers had in a multipolar system, such as Europe on the eve of the First World War, don't arise in a bipolar world. Doesn't matter whether a weaker ally defects or cooperates because, well, you're a global superpower. Then he turns around 5 pages later and says, well, in a bipolar world, there are no peripheries. Everything matters. Anything that could possibly increase the relative capabilities of the other superpower is of interest, or ought to be of interest to the United States. But then, in other places, he says some very interesting things about nuclear weapons. Very interesting, controversial things about nuclear weapons. In 1964, he published in a Delphi paper called Nuclear Weapons, More Would Be Better. Nuclear weapons are the ultimate strategic deterrent. The possession of even a rudimentary nuclear capacity makes a state effectively unconquerable. Therefore, if the United States' overriding strategic interest during the Cold War is to balance against the Soviet Union, why wouldn't the United States encourage its strategically vulnerable allies to obtain nuclear weapons? After all, it would make them unconquerable. Why would it go to such great lengths to preclude the spread of nuclear weapons, not just to adversaries, but to close allies as well? It doesn't make any sense from the standpoint of structural realism, this fixation with nuclear nonproliferation on the part of Washington policymakers in both political parties over the course of several decades. It certainly would not expect successive administrations to go to such great lengths as to risk rupturing alliance relations with allies like Israel and Pakistan over nuclear weapons. Maybe there's a way out. Perhaps one way to square structural realism, or at least my reading of structural realism with the record of what the United States actually did, is to say, well, in those those regions where an ally's nuclear weapons program might actually increase the near-term possibility of Soviet military or economic support to its own allies or proxies, one might expect the United States to try to coerce its ally, but that's sort of a weak cop-out. Nonetheless, that's one perspective on alliance coercion. This is just one baseline. The baseline being structural realism wouldn't expect presidential administration to go to such great lengths to coerce vulnerable allies from developing nuclear weapons programs. The second alternative to my theory is derived from liberalism, or Innenpolitik. Now, Innenpolitik, as the name suggests, privileges domestic sources of foreign policy, domestic ideologies, domestic political institutions, the role of societal actors and their preferences in shaping, indeed determining, the foreign policy behavior that the state pursues. The state, the administrative apparatus of government, doesn't have very much autonomy, especially in a liberal democracy like the United States. Elected politicians, and most presidents of the United States, Gerald Ford excluded, have been elected, are intensely worried about re-election. So they're going to be very well attuned to the preferences of the people's representatives in Congress. They're going to be very well attuned to the role of money and to the role of lobbying organizations. There are two variants of this underlying Innenpolitik set of theories which I want to highlight. The first is John Mearsheimer and Steve Walt's Israel lobby. Now, it might seem bizarre that I'm mentioning Walt and Mearsheimer's Israel lobby as a potential Innenpolitik alternative to my neoclassical realist hypothesis. After all, John Mearsheimer and Steve Walt, by their own admissions, are the foremost proponents of neorealism or structural realism. Yet, in their very controversial book, they present a quintessentially Innenpolitik argument. Their argument basically boils down to the fact, it boils down to the claim that there is a large, well-funded, but somewhat amorphous coalition of interest groups, which they call the Israel lobby, that systematically distorts U.S. foreign policy towards the Middle East and has done so for decades. The influence of these various groups that make up the Israel lobby groups is varied as the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, to Christian evangelicals who love Israel, to a whole host of think tanks and organizations. The impetus, or the main point which they're trying to make, is that these groups together make it extraordinarily difficult, by virtue of their access, by virtue of the money that they're able to raise, for any administration to pursue a hardline strategy towards Israel in areas in which objectively American and Israeli strategic interests do not coincide. This is relevant for my argument, or relevant for my study, because it suggests that one would expect, if this Israel lobby exists and has consistently been as influential as Walt and Mearsheimer claimed it to be, there would be very strong and very discernible opposition to any effort by any administration to break with Israel and to pursue coercive strategies of the types I mentioned much earlier towards the Israelis with respect to Israel's nuclear weapons program and, in the period in which I'm talking about, getting Israel to sign the 1971 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapons state. Moreover, one would expect to find very strong support by these groups for selling conventional weapons systems to Israel without any conditions attached. That's one variant. Now, the problem with the Innenpolitik theories of which there are many, is that, well, in the case of Pakistan, there is no pro-Pakistan lobby in the United States. Or maybe there is, it's just not terribly significant. It's nothing akin to the Israel lobby. For the two Pakistani nuclear nonproliferation cases, perhaps an innenpolitik hypothesis would not so much focus on the role of pro-Pakistani interest groups in Washington, but rather on the role of pro-nonproliferation members of Congress. The Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty enjoyed very strong support from senators in both political parties in the 1970s. Members of both political parties in both houses of Congress were quite concerned about nuclear nonproliferation in South Asia and quite suspicious of Pakistan's nuclear intentions, especially after the military coup that overthrew Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in mid-1977 and which brought the Chief of Army Staff Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq to power. Furthermore, the fact that Pakistan was a military dictatorship from 1977 until General Zia's mysterious death in a helicopter crash in April of 1988, a crash which also killed the US ambassador to Pakistan. One would expect, again, based on liberal peace theory, there to be a certain residual wariness towards Pakistan because it was not, by any stretch of the imagination, and still is not, a liberal democracy. Therefore, a liberal or an innenpolitik hypothesis might suggest that the shifts in the Carter administration and the Reagan administration's strategies towards dealing with Pakistan's nuclear weapons program were driven primarily, almost exclusively, by the need to avoid incurring the wrath of powerful senators and representatives, especially Democratic senators and representatives. My theory, and I know that I'm running low on time, tells a slightly different story. My neoclassical realist theory holds that the coercive strategies that the United States, that these three administrations pursued, were ultimately driven by the international system. That is, by how policymakers in Washington perceived the nature of the strategic environment that the United States confronted, and by the clarity of the systems which they were getting from that international environment. Now, as I said, the strategic environment for any state refers to the magnitude and the imminence of the international threats and opportunities. The more imminent and the larger the threats and the opportunities, the more restrictive the environment. The less imminent, that is, the further away in time, or the smaller the threats and the opportunities the state perceives itself to be facing, the more permissive the environment. But we have to be careful here. The degree of permissiveness or restrictiveness of any state's strategic environment is not synonymous with just the distribution of power. For example, the types and the magnitude of the threats and opportunities that a state like Israel, Pakistan, Norway faces are going to be fundamentally different than the types of threats and opportunities that the United States faces by virtue of their position in the international system, by virtue of the role that they play. Modern great powers often have strategic interests in different geographic regions. Consequently, a great power like the United States can simultaneously face a restrictive international environment in one theater and a permissive strategic environment in another theater. Moreover, the permissiveness or the restrictiveness of their environment can vary over time. Now, the degree of systemic clarity can also vary for a great power across different regions and across different time periods. Remember, the degree of systemic clarity pertains to how easily Leaders can discern threats and opportunities, the time frame or horizon which they expect those threats and opportunities to materialize, and whether they can identify a optimal solution to redress it. The intervening variable, as I said, are the height of the domestic mobilization hurdles. That is, the degree of congressional or interest group opposition or support for the administration's policies. Here, what's important is the time frame and the amount of information that's available to domestic actors. The longer the time frame and the more public the dispute between the United States and its ally, the more, or rather the greater the opportunity there is for congressional involvement and for interest group lobbying. The more secret, the less public the dispute is, the less opportunity there is. When an administration can secretly threaten or quickly impose a sanction or provide an inducement to an ally, the less domestic politics should matter, according to my theory. The more latitude the administration has. Conversely, the administration can't secretly make threats or can't secretly offer inducements, and the dispute becomes public or it drags out over a prolonged period of time, years, as opposed to weeks or sometimes days. The more opportunities there are for members of Congress and for domestic interest groups to intervene. Now, briefly, and I know that we are conscious of time, Aslan, I will give very short summations of the three cases. The Nixon administration. Between January and September of 1969, when I was but a gleam in my parents' eyes, the Nixon administration shifted its strategy towards Israel from trying to use U.S. conventional weapons sales, or the prospect of U.S. conventional weapons sales, to coerce the Israeli government into signing the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and disclosing the status of its nuclear weapons research to acceptance of Israel as a de facto nuclear armed state in exchange for the guarantee of not conducting a nuclear test and neither confirming nor denying the existence of its nuclear arsenal. So over the course of 9 months, the administration's policy shifts. What's interesting about my analysis of the documents from this period was the fact that at the beginning, in January and February, the members of the incoming Nixon administration come in and they think to a person that a nuclear-armed Israel would be a disaster for the United States. They fear that if Israel actually had a nuclear weapon, it would spark a regional arms race, that the Soviet Union would be forced to accelerate its conventional weapon sales to Syria and to Egypt, particularly after the humiliating defeat that they were dealt in the June 1967 war, and that American interests in the region would be harmed. And so deliberations begin in the Pentagon and in the State Department as to how to get the Israelis to sign the NPT. Now, in the fall of 1968 rather, the Johnson administration had received intelligence that Israel had probably already crossed the nuclear threshold, but LBJ had then promised then Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol that he would allow Israel to buy 50 F-4s and 25 A-20s on an accelerated time frame. He does this without telling the Defense Department. There are a series of very acrimonious meetings in the Pentagon between the Assistant Secretary of Defense, Paul Warnke, and future Israeli Prime Minister and Nobel laureate, and then U.S. ambassador, or then Israeli ambassador to Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, in which Warnke basically demands that Israel sign the NPT, and Rabin flat out refuses and says, I've got to speak to people in Jerusalem about this. Anyway, nothing gets done. The Nixon administration comes in, they realize that the Israeli nuclear weapons program is at such an advanced state that there is very, very little that the United States can do to thwart it. The best they can hope to do is to use conventional weapons sales as an inducement to the Israelis to promise not to test and not to talk. What's interesting from the standpoint of the alternative theory, the Innenpolitik Israel lobby theory, was the lack of documentary evidence that I found regarding the influence of the so-called Israel lobby. I have not found a single textual reference to it in any of their deliberations. And what's also interesting is the lack of documentary evidence to any concern that members of Congress might have about using arms sales to Israel as leverage for potential territorial concessions to start a peace process. The next two cases, I told you these would be overviews. 1977, the Carter administration. The Carter administration gets intelligence from the CIA regarding Pakistan's nuclear weapons program. And there are reports that Pakistan's nuclear weapons lab is trying to buy a reprocessing plant from a French firm. And the Carter administration puts very, very strong pressure on the French government of Valéry Giscard d'Estaing to cancel the contract, which they do. The Pakistanis are quite upset about it, but nowhere near as upset as the Carter administration would become when they learned about the existence of a parallel indigenous uranium enrichment program that the Pakistanis were running. This becomes public. Members of Congress, in particular, Senator Stuart Symington, Senator John Glenn of Ohio, and Representative Zablosky, who was the chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee, tell the administration that you must do something, and that a continuation of Pakistan's uranium enrichment in the absence of IAEA inspections ought to have consequences. The Carter administration imposes those consequences. It invokes the Symington Amendment in April of 1979. It cuts off all U.S. economic and military assistance to Pakistan and says, we're very sorry, we can't provide you arms or economic development assistance. All the while, it's receiving intelligence reports about a Soviet troop buildup in or near the vicinity of Afghanistan. At the same time, U.S. interests in Iran are under threat. In December of '79, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, and the Carter administration has a royal dilemma on its hands. How do you bolster Pakistan as a frontline state when you are precluded by law from selling Pakistan arms? How do you do this? And the result are a series of very acrimonious discussions, which ultimately lead nowhere. The more interesting case from my standpoint involves the 7-year relationship between the Zia-ul-Haq government and the Ronald Reagan administration. Reagan accelerates the Carter administration's program of providing covert assistance to the Afghan Mujahideen. And Pakistan, under Zia, becomes the key partner in doing that. Pakistan becomes the major conduit for providing weapons and providing money to the Afghans. Reagan manages to get Congress to pass a waiver and to remove the Symington Amendment provisions, which the Carter administration had put in place 2 years earlier. They propose a large aid package to Pakistan of economic assistance and conventional weapon systems. The problem is Pakistan's nuclear activities make people in Capitol Hill nervous. And so the Reagan administration has this conundrum. We need Pakistan. They know that we need us, that we need them. And yet they're continuing with their nuclear weapons program. So how do you persuade the Pakistanis to not violate or not act in ways that are going to force our hand? And the result was the 4, later 5 red lines. And as I mentioned at the outset, the Pakistanis routinely, brazenly violated or crossed the uranium enrichment threshold and the uranium enrichment no 5%, no enrichment over 5%, and the no attempting to export or import materials from third countries and the United States. And the result was a series of very brazen Pakistani nuclear smuggling cases in the late 80s and very, very complicated efforts by the Reagan administration to prevent Congress from imposing new sanctions. So my time has probably expired, and I would be happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Sterling effort, ladies and gentlemen. Let's take a 5-minute recess, get some more coffee and charge our glasses, and then we will return for questions and answers. And I hope you have some rather good ones. I know I do. Thank you very much. Well, this was a very stimulating talk. Please make yourself known if you want to ask any questions. But I will also ask some questions, but I will come in at the end because my questions are more in the present and not in the past. I think Olav Njøstad has a question first, the director.
I'm glad to start. Thank you for a very inspiring, interesting talk. And I sympathize very much with much of what you said. So I have a few comments and a question for you. The 3 examples you mentioned, to some extent, I think, illustrates what is sometimes referred to as the tyranny of the weak. That weaker states, quite in contradiction to what Waltz suggests, may actually have ability to influence or at least reject the attempt of the stronger state to dictate their behavior. And if that's the case, the immediate next question will be, how come? Why? And at the end of your talk, I think you came to a very important factor in the Israeli case, namely the timing of this acceptance, tacit acceptance by the Nixon administration of Israel as a de facto nuclear power state. What I was kind of missing in your presentation up till that point was, in other words, the status and the development in the other states. I mean, you concentrated, of course, on the United States, but my guess is that what's happening in these other states is quite important to understand the mechanisms here. Yes. And in the Israeli case, as you suggested, when we come to 1968, isn't it true that the Israeli program had come to such an advanced stage? So it was not only a question of whether the United States could try to stop a program still in development, but rather whether they could or would be willing, or if it would even be possible for the United States to roll back a program that has already passed the threshold. So that's a very different kind of case, and I think it's quite easy to understand in many ways why the stronger states would tacitly accept the facts. namely that Israel had already achieved the capability. So in terms of the Israeli nuclear development program, I think it's a harder case to explain, and I would like you to comment upon this. It's harder to explain the Kennedy administration's policy. They had the first satellite and U-2 photos, strongly indicating that there was a nuclear weapons program going on in the Dimona Desert. And they encouraged Norway not to export heavy water to Israel. When they learned that this would take place, they strongly advised Norway to insist on the right to inspect the use of this heavy water. And when Kennedy met with Ben-Gurion, then Prime Minister of Israel, in the White House, we know that he put pressure on Israel. He brought up the question of the Dimona power plant, and Ben-Gurion reacted exactly the same way as Mr. Rabin reacted some years later, indicating very strongly that Israel would do what it felt it had to do. But still, at this point in time, the United States would have had much stronger possibility to influence the Israeli program than they had 8 years later when the program had come to that advanced stage. So my question is to you, how will you explain what happened in the Kennedy administration? And then I would suggest this had to do with the importance of Jewish voters and strong sympathy with Israel domestically in the United States. Would a Democratic president who was looking forward to the next election risk the support of these groups by challenging the Israeli program? So my question to you is, how would you explain that case? How does it fit into your broader analysis? Thank you.
I think, well, you raise a number of questions, and let me try to aggregate them into two. First, and the broader question concerns the ability of weaker allies. Indeed, all allies of the United States are weaker than the United States, but the ability of allies of the United States to pursue nuclear weapons programs despite whatever qualms the United States might have. And the second involves a question of both timing of U.S. intervention and also the domestic political constraints on U.S. presidents at the time they decide to or not to intervene. Taking the tangible question regarding the timing of the Israeli, or the timing of the various demarques to Israel, one of the reasons I think that Kennedy was unable to have very much impact on the Israeli nuclear program in 1962 was the fact that at that point the United States really didn't have anything that could be called an alliance with Israel. The first major arms sales, sales of conventional weapons to the United States, by the United States to Israel, came in the aftermath of the June 1967 war. There was some collaboration between the United States and Israel, and indeed concerns about Israel's nuclear aspirations and about the nuclear reactor in Dimona predated Kennedy. Eisenhower was the first US president to raise these concerns, and Allen Dulles was the first DCI to bring the status of Dimona to the president's attention, although the Kennedy administration and CIA had far more intelligence, at least aerial intelligence and rudimentary photography from the Corona satellites in 62 and 63 than Eisenhower had in 59 and 1960. So the timing I think you're right, is crucial. The advantage that the Israelis had in bargaining with the Nixon administration in '69 was the fact that they were able to develop their program with very little focused attention by the United States up until the end of the 1960s. From 1963 onward, where is the primary focus of the attention of Kennedy, and then especially Lyndon Johnson and the members of his national security team? South Asia, not the Middle East. One of the inherent advantages that allies of the United States have in bargaining with the United States in issues that they consider to be crucial to their national security is the fact that from their perspective, they only have to focus on what's going on in their region. The United States is a global superpower with interests in multiple regions. The problem is that successive American presidents and members of their national security teams are not terribly good, and indeed it's an unfair standard, it might be impossible, to give equal attention to all regions simultaneously. There is an expression which the presumptive Democratic nominee, Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton, has used, I can walk and chew gum at the same time. Well, I can't, personally. I don't chew gum. Anyway, but it's difficult to focus equally on all of these regions, particularly when one is dealing with an issue as complex and as fraught as nuclear nonproliferation by a state which, rightly or wrongly, in the case of Israel and Pakistan, rightly, perceives itself as vulnerable to not just attack, but possibly annihilation by its neighbors. That's point number one. Point number two pertains to a more general observation, and here I'm going to compare the instances in which the United States, quote, successfully coerced its ally or an ally into halting their nuclear weapons programs or halting their nuclear aspirations, as opposed to the cases of Israel and Pakistan in which they did not. In addition to the question of tangible security guarantees in the form of bilateral or multilateral security treaties and in troop deployments, the advantage which the Pakistanis and the Israelis had that the West Germans, the South Koreans, and the Taiwanese did not was time. The United States was able to coerce Konrad Adenauer's government and then Ludwig Erhard's government after that, and to coerce the Park government in South Korea and the Chiang government in Taipei to halt their nuclear weapons program successfully, because those programs are at a very, very rudimentary stage. Very rudimentary. In all three instances, leaders in Bonn, in Taipei, and in Seoul made the decision, or made preliminary decisions, to explore developing nuclear weapons programs in response to what they perceived to be as tangible threats of abandonment by the United States. They were responding to what they thought, well, are the Americans going to be here if the Soviets attack? Are the Americans going to be here? Carter is talking about pulling out troops from South Korea. Oh my God, what are we going to do? And so it was relatively easy for the Kennedy administration, the Johnson administration, the Ford and the Carter administrations to coerce those governments than it was for the Nixon administration, and then later the Carter and the Reagan administrations to coerce Israel and then Pakistan, respectively. So coming back to the broader point which I would like to make is that, yes, there are certain advantages, if one can call them advantages, to being a small, strategically embattled state in a volatile region, in which you're only focused on your survival in that region as opposed to being a global superpower with interests in multiple regions. One final comment, and this involves the Kennedy administration and the anticipation of the '64 campaign in the role of domestic politics. I would not deny that John Kennedy and members of the White House staff were very cognizant of ethnic group politics and of the need to raise money, or at least to avoid alienating a segment of the Democratic coalition. And that, I don't think, poses very much of a problem for my particular argument. Where I do question the Israel lobby thesis, as it were, is this notion that there is this very large, very well-funded group that consistently wins every battle, or has consistently won every battle for about 50 years, when the origins of that group, or that lobby that Walter Mearsheimer talked about, really didn't begin until the later 1960s. It wasn't in place in 61, 62, and 63. So that was a very long-winded answer, but I thought it was a very good and very thought-provoking question, and I thank you.
Yes, there seems to be a certain order to this. First Olav speaks and then I speak. This was a very stimulating talk. I enjoyed it. I'm not sure exactly what I learned from it, but maybe you reminded us of a certain political science theory. But you started out with these three overriding objectives, which, I mean, the United States will pursue certain goals: containment, beneficial economic climate, and then non-proliferation. These are the overriding goals. And you should then expect that they will be carried through in certain ways, since they are the three overriding objectives. What the study of history has taught me, at least, is that yes, you may have as many overriding objectives as you want, but there will always, something will almost always happen that will intervene even with these overriding objectives. And I'm sure that if you have broadened your study, you would have seen this even more clearly, because you could, of course, argue that you should have studied entirely different cases. Because there are many more cases. There is the British case. Of course, the United States was initially opposed to Britain having nuclear weapons. And you have the French case, even more interesting. Initially opposed, but then more or less agreeing to assist the French. So, and then you have certain other cases, Libya being a very curious case, where Gaddafi actually agreed to modified his program on weapons of mass destruction, and you have more productive cases like South Africa, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan. So I'm wondering what is special with these cases. I think that the more you broaden the number of cases, the more complications you will run into. This is just an assumption, but I think it would provide it would be challenging for your theory if you broaden the caseload.
I think it would be. I think that's an interesting set of questions, and let me address them broadly. First of all, for the purposes of this talk and purposes of the paper which I'm writing for the symposium, I'm focusing on alliance coercion between allies. So that automatically excludes the Libya case. Libya has never been, and arguably never will be, an ally of the United States. It was an adversary state. And I will be the first to admit, Gaddafi's decision to surrender his rudimentary weapons of mass destruction programs is a fascinating process, and one that's worthy of examination, but that's not the book that I'm writing right now. The British and the French cases, however, I think are quite relevant to what I'm talking about, because here, as you correctly pointed out, the United States undergoes a very dramatic evolution in both cases, from being opposed to the UK developing nuclear weapons to not only facilitating Britain's nuclear weapons program, but actually creating structures so that the United States and Britain are closely, or in effect, joined at the hip when it comes to nuclear weapons. In the case of France, again, you have this situation in which the United States, the Eisenhower administration, is initially somewhat ambivalent, although remember, this is the same administration that was talking quite favorably and quite openly about sharing nuclear weapons within NATO and encouraging certain NATO allies, including the French and the West Germans at one point, to develop indigenous nuclear weapons programs as a way of reducing the long-term burden on the American taxpayer of defending Western Europe against a Soviet attack. Trachtenberg talks about this at great length in his 1999 book, A Constructed Peace. So yes, that's a very interesting set of two very, very interesting cases, and perhaps I will explore them, given that the barriers, at least of studying what happened on the American side, are not terribly difficult. In the case of trying to get into the British archives with the Official Secrets Act, I don't know whether I could get access to that, and I lack the language skills to get into the French archives, even if I were to have access to them. But those are two very good points. Now, with respect to the former Soviet republics, Belarus, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, again, these were not allies of the United States. In those instances, and again, my reading of those cases is based entirely on secondary literature, The inference that I have drawn was that the reason why they surrendered Soviet nuclear warheads and Soviet nuclear delivery systems was not so much the security guarantees delivered or given, offered by the United States, and in the case of Ukraine by the European Union and by NATO, but the fact that they couldn't afford to maintain them. And the fact that, at least in the case of the Ukrainian nuclear weapons, the crews were Russians. So it's a question of, well, are you going to keep a nuclear deterrent? Are you going to keep a nuclear arsenal that you do not have the wherewithal to maintain? Is actually going to cost you a tremendous amount of money, and may, because of the ethnicity and the nationality of the crews that are maintaining those facilities, actually pose more of a risk to your security than surrendering them to the Russians.
It wasn't their weapons, they were Russian weapons.
They were Russian weapons. They were Russian weapons, which of course created the security problem for Kiev and for Belarus. So again, those are very interesting questions. I don't see this book project expanding to look at the surrender of the nuclear weapons by the former Soviet republics. But I think the British and the French cases are very interesting ones, and I will have to think very carefully about them. They are true allies.
A true ally, and Israel was a very special ally.
Israel was a very special ally. As I mentioned at the outset, the working title of the project is Frenemies.
Thank you, and thanks for an interesting talk. It was really engaging and a thoughtful analysis. I just wanted to sort of add my voice to the list of the folks who were interested in finding out more what was going on inside the ally during this process. And I'll explain why. I tend to think of the situations that you're describing as being similar to situations of sanctions, in some cases actually involving sanctions. And one of the more intriguing things about sanctions is how often they fail. And this was a puzzle in the quantitative IR literature for quite some time, until people came along and said, well, what's going on is that the sanctions are not actually constraining the target of the sanctions at all. What they are doing is screening out countries that are willing to suffer sanctions from countries that are not willing to suffer sanctions. And as a result, the only countries that challenge sanctions are the ones that are willing to suffer the consequences. So my anticipation going in would be that, that the threat of U.S. response to its allies would constrain many of them from even trying to proliferate in the first place. But the set of countries that does choose to proliferate, my anticipation a priori, would be the ones that are willing to suffer the costs of that the U.S. would impose. So that, to my mind, brings up the question, when in fact the U.S. does sort of turn around, as in the cases of Great Britain and France, is it because they came up against sort of situations in which there was no willingness to bend? Is it simply the selection effect, or is there something else going on? And in those cases in which the sanctions do actually succeed in producing results, that strikes me as very surprising, and I'd like to know why. So that, I like the sort of interposing sort of contraposition of theoretical perspectives, and I wanted to sort of toss the sort of rationalist literature on sanctions in there as well, because I think it's an interesting perspective, and I think it could add another dimension to the project.
Thank you, Bear. I think that's a very very good question, and there is a selection effect that's going on here. Now, I think one has to acknowledge that when one talks about nuclear proliferation and nuclear non-proliferation, we're talking about the ultimate small n phenomena. The ultimate small n phenomena. The number of states that have contemplated and seriously invested money into even exploring developing nuclear weapons is relatively small, extremely small. The number of states that have actually developed nuclear weapons programs of various types is even smaller. And the number of states which have actually done so to the point in which it actually drew the attention of the United States in concerted efforts by the United States to forestall their proliferation efforts is even smaller. So I'm saying, we have an N of what, 6? So there's a problem from the standpoint of trying to develop a generalizable theory or generalizable hypotheses, because the number of observations is so small. I think your point about the sanctions and about the selection effects of sanctions, the states that are willing to challenge the United States and are willing to suffer the effects of sanctions, is a very important one. The states which have gone down the road of nuclear proliferation, at least the U.S. allies that were willing to go down the road of nuclear proliferation, were ones that, to use the term Nuno Monteiro coined in his book, Theory of Unipolar Politics, these were states that were in a Hobbesian international environment. They were facing, a deep security dilemma in their respective region. If you are Pakistan and you are right next to much larger, more powerful India, it makes perfect. If I were the Prime Minister of Pakistan, or more properly, if I were the Chief of Army Staff in Pakistan, I'd want nuclear weapons. Who wouldn't? If I were the Chief of the Israeli Defense Staff, or the Prime Minister in the 1950s, I'd want nuclear weapons. Why wouldn't I? Give me a good reason why I shouldn't go down the road. You have no allies. Yes, you get some equipment from the French, some weapon systems from the French and from the Belgians, but you're surrounded on all sides by states that not just are intent to or have designs on your territory, they want to destroy you. So it makes perfectly good sense from that standpoint. So you're right, there is a selection effect that's at work there. My task is to figure out, all right, well, how am I going to deal with this selection effect, and how am I going to deal with the fact that, like many phenomena in international relations and security studies, I'm talking about a set of a really small number of cases.
Jeff, allow me to be a bit horrible with you now towards the end. This is the final question, and we've been in the past, but you have written a theory of international politics. Back in 1989, Dan Smith wrote a book called NATO, High Pressure, How the United States Runs NATO. And in the 2 decades that followed, many of the assumptions in this book have been proven wrong. The United States find it difficult to run NATO. The alliance is now going to meet in Warsaw on July 8th and 9th. And everything is on the table in Warsaw. Conventional force posture, but also nuclear posture. Based on your theory and on the factors driving American security and foreign policy, what are the American position going to be, and will they succeed in coercing their allies into, well, acquiescing to the American position on nuclear and conventional force posture, notably in Eastern Europe?
The short answer to your question is no. The Obama administration will not succeed if the objective of the Obama administration is to get the 28 members of NATO to dramatically increase their defense spending, i.e. every member of the alliance spend the 2.5% of GDP, which was agreed upon at the Lisbon NATO summit 7-8 years ago. If that's the objective is to build more rapid reaction forces for deployment to Eastern Europe, to come to a set of agreements as to how to deal with the fraying of the alliance in the East, and I'm speaking here specifically of Turkey, and to contribute more to defense and to agree to the deployment of advanced weapon systems in certain theaters. And no, I don't think that's a realistic aspiration. The leaders of all of the NATO countries know that there's going to be a new president of the United States come January 20th, 2017. Most of them are praying that it might be the Democrats, perhaps one or two, maybe thinking, well, we could work with him if possible. But we built a wall, he's talking about building a wall, I'm talking about Orban Trump. But no, I don't think that is realistic. You know, when I began this project, Asla, one of the things that prompted me to begin thinking about the United States' relationships with some of its recalcitrant allies were the sheer level of acrimony and the stories about how utterly dysfunctional the United States' relationships with Israel, between Obama and Netanyahu, and Pakistan, first between George W. Bush and Pervez Musharraf, and then Obama and Pervez Musharraf, and then Ali Ashraf Zardari, and now Nawaz Sharif is back in power. And of course we had the Abbottabad raid on Osama bin Laden's compound. And my working assumption when I started the project was that, gee, it was probably much easier for the United States to coerce its allies during the Cold War than it has become in the 25 years since the Cold War, which seems terribly paradoxical. And I'm finding that no, actually it wasn't. It was pretty difficult for the United States to get its way on a whole host of issues. Now, I've just spoken very briefly, perhaps too briefly, about three difficult cases in which the United States attempted to dissuade vulnerable allies from going down the road, or actually going down the road of either nuclear breakout or actually trying to forestall a nuclear weapons program that was already fairly well advanced. What has become more difficult for the United States, and I think will become more difficult as we move further into the 21st century, is the fact that we have alliance structures which were created in response to one threat and which have persisted long past the structural conditions which gave rise to them and which serve a variety of purposes. And we, being the United States, have expanded the membership of those alliances and sought to perpetuate them without really thinking, well, what exactly do we expect our allies to do other than to say yes to us? And these are very difficult, not just conceptual problems, but political problems for whoever becomes the next president of the United States or whoever becomes the next Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense for the United States. What do you want NATO to be? What do you want NATO to do? Mission first, then think about the types of capabilities that need to be developed in order to achieve those missions, not perpetuate the alliance and assume that everyone is going to fall in line and just give the United States whatever it wants. So that's my unpolitique answer to your very thoughtful question, which shows I will probably never be able to have political office in the United States, but I'm fine with that.
Thank you ever so much. Stimulating talk. I hope you will all join us here next Thursday when Professor Braunmüller will be addressing the same audience. Thank you ever so much.